Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final installment of our Core Conversation Series. My name is Martha Osterbiel, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. By now, some of you are probably aware of our recent transformation. In September, after 176 years, the Maryland Historical Society reopened its doors as the Maryland Center for History and Culture, an identity that better reflects our mission and vision to provide space for the public to discover and develop a deeper understanding of our nation's history through a Maryland prism. The Maryland Center for History and Culture has always been more than a museum and library. We aim to facilitate meaningful conversations and dialogue, exploring the enormous impact Marylanders have had on our nation's history. Over the last several months, we've witnessed how important these conversations are during this time of transition and uncertainty in our country, our city, and our organization. Thousands of individuals interested in our region's history and in historic moments relevant to today have participated in our virtual programming, greatly expanding our reach beyond our walls and our state. And we're really looking forward to continuing these conversations well into the future. The four-part virtual Core Conversation series that you're all tuning into celebrates the launch of our new identity. Each program asks a relevant and driving question, prompting conversation about important historical and cultural topics while highlighting our new core values: discovery, dialogue, authenticity, and community that drive all of our initiatives, including education programs, public programs, exhibitions, research requests, and visitor interactions. I encourage you to read our new mission and vision and values on our website, which I just placed into the chat. So today we're incredibly pleased and just really thrilled to welcome Dr. Portia Moore and Nina Simon to our final discussion about community. Dr. Portia Moore is an activist scholar who employs critical race theory to interrogate museums and other cultural heritage spaces. A contributing writer and project advisor for the Inclusium, Portia's writing and research is used as training and learning materials at museums across the United States. She's the co-creator of the Visitors of Color Project, a national counter-narrative project recognized by the American Alliance of Museums as a resource on DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, that highlights lived experiences, insights, and reflections on modern museums from marginalized people. She has served as an advisor to museums as Site for Social Action, the Minneapolis Institute for Art, and Museums and Race. She has been a consultant curator for the Columbia Museum of Art and a curator of the rotating African American Gallery, Spoken. Portia is an assistant professor of museum studies in the School of Art and Art History at the University of Florida. And in addition, she is part of the teaching faculty at Johns Hopkins University in the Museum Studies program. Portia is an avid outdoor enthusiast and cultivates healing hikes and other outdoor activities to connect African Americans with nature and green spaces. She brings her ethics of critical race theory and inclusion to the outdoors in a variety of projects and partnerships with outdoor and cultural heritage spaces. Welcome, Dr. Moore. We're so grateful to have you here with us today.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much, Martha and Katie. I'm so excited to be here.
Nina Simon is the space maker and CEO of By For All, a global nonprofit that creates digital tools to help civic and cultural organizations become more inclusive, relevant, and sustainable. The Of By For All Change Network program involves over 50 museums, libraries, parks, theaters, and nonprofit organizations, all taking bold strides to become of, by, and for their diverse communities. Prior to founding Of, By, For All, Nina was the executive director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, where she led a dramatic turnaround and 8 years of growth rooted in community involvement. Nina is the best-selling author of The Participatory Museum and The Art of Relevance. She's been named an Ashoka Fellow, Museum Visionary by the Smithsonian Magazine, and Santa Cruz County Woman of the Year. Nina lives off the grid in the Santa Cruz Mountains with 20 people, 24 chickens, 3 dogs, and 1 zip line. Welcome, Nina. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
And last but not least, Katie Caljean is the Vice President of Education and Strategic Engagement, managing multiple aspects of public engagement at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. At the leadership level, she oversees on-site and virtual public programs, K-12 and university level programs, youth and family programs, adult tours, outreach and community partnerships, marketing and communications, and academic publications. Katie joined the MCHC in 2012, where she has served in many capacities throughout the organization, ranging from fundraising events to strategic planning. Originally from Northern New Jersey, Katie holds a bachelor's in anthropology with minors in archaeology and arts administration from Drew University, and a master's in museum anthropology from Columbia University, a joint graduate program with the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Katie, welcome.
Hi, so glad we're all together. This is exciting.
So, without further ado, Katie, I'll turn the conversation over to you. And I just want to reiterate to everyone, please feel free to engage with us in the chat and ask questions. We'll leave some time at the end to address them.
Absolutely. So Martha, you did a really wonderful job explaining our new core values and the reason we put together this conversation series as a means to unpack some of these concepts. So community is a word that you could bundle a lot under it, but it needs some unraveling to talk about what do we actually mean by that word. And so when we were writing out our core values, a lot of these other important concepts fit under that umbrella. And so for us, when we talk about community, we're really talking about how we can be inclusive, representative, relevant, and responsive and useful to the world around us and the people that we encounter, or with the people we encounter or the people we'd like to encounter, right? So for us, we're trying to package these concepts together, the idea that community is collective, community is inclusive, community gathers, whether that be in person or virtually. It's built on participation. It's, our community should be involved. And like in terms of our role as an organization, we should be responsive to what's happening in their lives. So for me, when I think of community, all of those things are bundled together, but I really would love to hear from both Portia and Nina. When we say the word community, we're having a core conversation about community. What does that mean for you? Portia, I don't know, maybe you want to start?
You took a sip first.
I saw that.
I saw the, no, go ahead.
So I will have to say, thank you so much, Katie, for that question. I will have to say that for a very long time, especially because I am a critical race scholar, for a very long time, whenever I would hear the word community or see the word community, and I think about the greater context, but also the ways in which we use that word as part of our lexicon, and it's definitely a core part of museum literature, for example. Mm-hmm. Just even museum speak, if you attend any museum conference, you're going to find something about community. If you look at our job descriptions, you'll see a lot of positions have the word community. I have always viewed community as a kind of code word, because if you look at the way in which it is often used, it's used as a code for underrepresented or Black or brown or impoverished. And I've always really struggled with that, even though I know that all of our museums are, usually community centered. So that's the long way of me saying that, especially now, during this pandemic, community now means, I think, something even more nuanced for me. When I think about who is your pod, who's your community, who are the people that you identify that you can actually rely upon if you need help, are those the people that you can call? So I will say that my sense of community now has definitely shifted because of the pandemic. But for me, community literally means that when I think about my local institution, at least, I want to be able to call out someone's name and be able to say that they know my name in return and that we are working towards an ever evolving relationship. So for me, that is what community means. And I guess the last thing that I want to say is over the last 2 years, I would say, I have really come to also understand that community, when we talk about community, we as a museum professionals, we are community. Like we don't often sort of, I don't want to say center ourselves, but we don't count ourselves in that number of community. And I think that if we did, that would also shift our perspective about what we talk about or what we mean when we say community.
It's interesting. Absolutely. Well, it's a different bubble, right? Like we have our own community. It's communities. It's a plural. It's
Yes.
Oftentimes we say community as a singular, your community, but we are people with multiple identities, right? Like we fit in different places, and so that's something to think about.
Yes.
Nina, what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I want to appreciate, Portia, how you grounded us there, because I think you're right that for a long time, the word community was used to mean all those people out there, all those brown and black people, all those poor kids, all those people who we need to do outreach to is the other word that often came up with, right? And I think that even to what you both just were talking about the communities that we're part of, the thing I've really been thinking about a lot with communities is how can we get more honest and transparent about saying, here are the communities that we serve quite well, that we ourselves as staff members, as board members, as volunteers might be a part of, and who are the communities around us who we may have invisibilized, who we may have exploited, who we may have ignored, or we may just not have considered. And I remember when I was running the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, one of the things we did early on, just to kind of check ourselves, was we took a map of our city, which is not a big city, and we as a staff said, okay, where are the places where we go quite often? Where do we go to the laundromat? Where do we go out to dinner? Where do we go for walks? And we identified that as a team at that time of mostly white women, we were not even aware of or setting foot into parts of our city where there are communities, where there are people, and that they were that's a form of invisibilizing as well, that when we presume that we are professionals who exist to engage communities kind of in a very even way, that ignores the fact that we have our own paths we walk every day, our own biases, our own things that we ignore or that we attend to. And I think that, in the work that we do now with Of By For All with organizations around the world, we're always starting from this place of how can you get honest and get real about who are the communities who are quite close to you and who are quite engaged, and who are communities who you may not even know how to name them because they are far from the experience of the people who are in the room making these decisions.
Right. Well, that idea of invisibility, we often think about that in terms of like our own site being invisible to outsiders coming in, but we also, there are invisible spaces out there for us personally that we don't know exist. And defining those roles of insider and outsider, who's inside, who's outside. Maybe Nina, you could talk a little bit about like those concepts for you and how you can make doors. You often use the concept of a door, an invisible door, a key to get into the room. These are really good metaphors, but it's all a matter of perspective, right? Who's on the inside and who's on the outside.
Yeah, and so, and you're speaking of, the metaphor that's kind of at the heart of the book, The Art of Relevance, is this idea that if meaning exists behind a locked door, then relevance is the key to unlock that meaning. And that there are a lot of people who walk by doors, metaphorical or physical, and may either feel like, ooh, I'm really interested, I want to be inside, or, oh yeah, I have that key, I'm part of this place. And there are a lot of people who walk by those doors and don't see them, or who see a sign that says museum and they see a sign that says, to their mind, your story has been erased, your objects have been stolen, that this is not a place where I'm going to feel welcome or I'm going to feel like I belong. And so I think, again, it starts with like getting real about insiders are not inside by accident. It's not like randomly every third person was like, ooh, I feel great in this museum. When we look around, and especially you see this in organizations like yours, Katie, where they're in a transition, or maybe they're quite new, and it's like a couple years in, and you had intentions about community and inclusion, and then you look around and you say, okay, who's actually here? Who actually heard that call and heard it as an invitation as opposed to as a threat? Who felt like, oh yeah, I do have that key. And so I think that an insider, the reason I use that language partly is about getting away from this idea of new communities. I always hate that idea that like we're discovering, no. But this idea that there are some people who feel quite a lot of privilege, who feel quite a lot of entitlement, and who feel quite comfortable inside the organization. And then there are people who are outside, some because we have deliberately excluded them, some because for them inside is somewhere else, something else is of interest or feels close to them. And I think one of the things I think about most in this way is that our job, when we think about what we've done well by our insiders, it's that we really got to know them and we are really honoring their full humanity, what's going to make them not just interested, what kind of exhibits and programs, but also what kind of seating makes them feel comfortable. Do they need like baby changing things in the bathroom? Like, do we serve wine and cheese at receptions, or do we serve beer and chips, or do we serve apple juice and cookies? Or do we have a barbecue? And all of those choices signal to people and reinforce their sense of insiderness. So I think one of the fallacies we have is we believe that what we are offering is neutral, and it's just that the people outside haven't heard the call, or we haven't advertised it in the right way or something. It's like, no, actually everything we've chosen, the hours we're open, the way we present, is reinforcing comfort for our insiders and is reinforcing irrelevance to outsiders. And so I think that the big question here is not like, what do we do to sell what we have to outsiders? It's what choices might we make differently if we wanted somebody on the outside to feel like this was made for them, the way our closest insiders feel very welcome within our spaces.
Right. And that does speak in some ways to accessibility and the way in which our services are made available to different communities. Like exactly what you're saying about like hours, or like having a sensory space for students with autism, or closed captioning for our virtual programs, like ways that would make that entry into the inside space a little bit easier, opening up those avenues so that they can gain insider status.
Yeah,
and
just challenge back, Katie, that I think absolutely, and I think access work is super needed and important. And I think that we often, particularly white professionals, we do it in what we see as a race neutral way. And then it's like we're surprised, or we don't take that next step to name and ask the question of, why is it mostly white people here? Why, when we added those access things, why did we go to bat for closed captioning, but maybe we didn't go to bat for multilingual, or we didn't go to for changing whose voice is actually being displayed and whose story is being displayed. So I think that I agree with you. And I think we have to kind of be careful and check ourselves that we're not choosing. I think that there are ways it's incredible that we've done work on accessibility around disability, and also I would say around gender. I think a lot of museums have been making a lot of strides. But there has been more reticence around taking that same kind of creative eagerness, raising and devoting resources, and naming when it comes to race. And so I think that, and I'd be so curious, Portia, you live in the conversation and the discourse around that much more deeply than I do. But I think that there's sometimes a feint around it where we stop when it comes to naming race in the same way we've named some of these other things.
Right. Portia, what are your thoughts?
So many. So A question that I would begin with to kind of unpack and respond is,
Mhm.
what if being outside was safe? Like if it was such that being outside of the institution literally meant your own safety. And so
Mhm.
I'll begin with that question by sharing a short little story. So in a museum that I used to work in, there was this beloved um, Black woman board member. And she probably is in her late 50s, maybe early 60s. And I will never forget, she shared this story one time where she was coming out. I mean, everyone loves her. She was coming out of the museum one day, broad daylight, and an elderly woman stopped and looked at her and said, "What are you doing in there? Like, what is this building and what are you doing in there?" And almost this indication as well as, are you safe? Like, did they allow, almost like, did they allow you to come in there? Like, what's your role? What's your purpose? And I have never forgotten that. And what that, they had a whole other conversation about what it meant and, historically what that building meant for a community, right? For different communities. But what that helped me to understand very clearly is that, and what I think all of us have seen, particularly within the pandemic, is that as people of color, particularly as Black folks where I'm from in the South, the issues of safety are literally something that we navigate every single day, especially as we're navigating public spaces. And so, from what I gathered from that story that was told to me, it's about the notion of memory. So, as a community, the memory is shared that X, Y, and Z place is not safe, or X, Y, and Z place is not welcoming, or X, Y, and Z place, you have to navigate it in such a mental way that you might as well not have an investment in it. So that I have to say that with the question, I totally understand it. And I understand it, especially in the context of Nina's amazing book on relevance. But it's that language is something that I grapple with, because for many people who already their very existence and their proximity to the notion of citizenship is actually challenged, to talk about being outside and inside. Well, what if your lived experience is always in a way that you're outside, right? So then how do you even begin to think about the entree? So I tend to often think about the notion of like othering and belonging. And yeah, this notion of othering and belonging. And so how then can we all think about, how do we increase belonging? Like, what does that actually look like in our institutions? So I will honestly say that when I think about like the journey of your particular institution, that name change is a step, I think, into this whole other exploration of how you can belong. When I think about, is it in San Diego? Yeah, the Museum of Man, and how they've changed their name
Yes.
to the Museum of Us.
Yeah.
That,
Awesome.
that's just like a
Awesome.
tiny fragment, but yeah, I think it's not for me, because then to me it relates to this whole notion of like invitation and who gets invited and I think it really is about othering and belonging. So there should be some type of checklist that we're all working from, where we can say, so a person I just love and admire is Adrienne Marie Brown. I love the way that she thinks. She always has these powerful, critical questions. But one of the things that she has been writing and talking about in the last year or so is about what are healing behaviors? So if we apply that to the museum context, what are some healing behaviors? And to extend that, if we have a daily checklist, what are the ways that we are creating a sense of belonging? And what are the behaviors or ways that we are creating a sense of othering? And if you follow that checklist and you're telling the truth, then you don't have to work in dimensions of outside and inside. You can
Right.
just have this checklist that says this behavior or this institutional practice or this way of thinking is actually othering. and then you can modify your behavior. So I guess what I would also say is, for me, a lot of this work that we're always talking about is posture. It is behavior. It is how we're going to change these institutional things that will have this rippling effect. So yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that's great. That's at the crux of a lot of this. It's the idea of what are you a part of? Where do you belong? And what infrastructure is in place that like needs to be moved aside so that we can enable people to feel that this is a place for them. And thinking about, you know, our transformation, we were the Maryland Historical Society, now we're the Maryland Center for History and Culture. That idea of society, it was confusing, quite honestly. People don't know, is it a place I can go? Is it a physical building? Is it a concept? Is it a club? Is it something I have to be a member to come in? So, you know, just like breaking that down. And the word center also, it like, for us, it's a place, but it's also a concept. It's a place where ideas come together, because we may not necessarily have people attending our programming or using our resources that come on site. So, and we're museum and library. So there's a lot of discussion about what is the right word to use to describe our organization. We landed on center, so we're feeling pretty good about it. And, you know, it's abstract, but also concrete. And at least it invites people in, that, you know, it's a place where everybody's welcome. And so I think along these lines, like something else like we need to be thinking about is just in terms of like the products we create, like the services, the different resources that we have for people to have some sort of entry point in. There's a lot of assumption on the inside for museum professionals, assuming that we know what people need, right? Like what would be useful for any community. I'm thinking about teachers, thinking about inner city kids, thinking about people who are becoming citizens. You know, what could an organization change their business model to be thinking about? Well, I have these resources. You know, we have information about, you know, the founding of the nation. Like how does that help with, you know, citizenship training? Or, you know, how can you take what you have and build on it and create resources that are, again, useful for the communities out there? And so, Nina, I know you talk in the Art of Relevance about this idea of assets and wants and needs. And we've been really trying to think internally about how we can build on our assets. But, you know, so that's still inside. How do you get the community out there to tell you what would be useful? What would be, how can you be responsive with the people you serve? So I'll throw that to Nina to start.
Yeah, well, and I'll connect it to also, you know, when Portia was talking about the othering and belonging checklist, that's not something you can guess at and completely create within your building, right? It's rooted in deep knowledge and curiosity about what that checklist looks like for somebody who might be very critical or important to you and to your organization's future. And so, you know, the approach that we take with the By For All program and with all these organizations around the world is really to support them in saying, who's a community who we see as critical to our future, and how can we spend time listening and learning from that community so that we are not jumping and rooting in our assumptions of what is needed or wanted or useful, but where we're building some relationships, where we're building some knowledge and some sense of starting to feel that shared sense. What Portia said in the beginning about, I know somebody and they know my name too. So how do you start to build these relationships? And then Katie, to what you're saying, how do you do it in this asset-based way, where instead of saying, oh, those poor kids don't have art, we're going to give them art, or, oh, people who are becoming citizens need information about history and we can give that to them. How can we, that's very focused on the idea that the institution has the assets and the community has the needs, right? And instead, what we like to look at, and I think this is something we've seen get much stronger during the pandemic, is this fact that we all have assets, and it's a conversation about how are we going to share assets to build collectively these places of belonging, these places of story that are really true to the diversity of who's in our greater cities or regions. And so, you know, I think, for example, about one of the organizations in the By For All network that is not a museum, is a public media network in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where they've said, we really want to build relationships with African-American activists in the north and east side of our city, and that they saw that there was potentially an asset combination around activists who are looking to reshape the narrative of their own experience, of their own community, and to get their voices heard, and a media center that has tools for training, for platform building and resources. And so there's a connection of those assets and a potential alliance of those interests, and I think that we often also are quite surprised by what works for, or what's on those lists, right? There's a botanical garden and museum we're working with in Delaware who, as they really got to know Latinx and Hispanic families in their area, one of the things they heard about was a thing around othering around their security officers and the uniforms of those security officers. And so they reworked, what is that role? What is that title? What is that job description? What are they wearing? And you can imagine that that's something that can have impact on other communities as well. But it started from them listening to a community who they felt were critical to their future. And so I think that it can't be about us sitting inside our buildings and saying, ooh, how could we creatively redeploy? It has to be starting from, who do we want to listen more closely to? And how could we start to fill out our guesses on those checklists based on what we're hearing? And then how are we checking in? How are we building some community accountability, some feedback loop, so that we're getting to know what is working and what isn't as we're making those changes?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Portia, I see the gears turning.
So I'm to be honest, I'm responding a little bit more to something that you said, Katie, in the beginning, and I was trying to think about what the segue was. But so I'm going to say this. I don't know if it's necessarily a pushback. I'm going to say this also knowing that fully well that I am currently working in higher ed and I am part of academia, so I totally get that. Are museums, or should museums have a business model, or should they really lean more towards an education model? Now, and that to me is the existential sort of question that has really been churning in me, particularly since I think it was over the summer when we did the Death to Museums conference.
Mm-hmm.
And there was so many people being like, what do you mean death to museums? But, which I thought it's a lot of rich conversation. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I struggle sometimes with the fact that we often frame museums as a business,
Mm-hmm.
when maybe the model is that museums are informational tools or educational tools, and there's another framework that has business components that would help us achieve these greater outcomes. And again, I'm saying that as someone who's a part of higher ed, that is a business, and I totally get that. But for example, I think one of the things that I just could not understand when we saw all of these layoffs and furloughs in the beginning of the pandemic, it was clear that we don't always think about museums as components of education, because I did not, I mean, maybe it was something that existed. I did not see it. I did not see, well, we had this gap, we had this need, right? So you talk, going back to Nina talking about assets and need. We had
Mhm.
this national need to
Mhm.
have students be educated on digital platforms. And we have this brilliant body of museum educators that were then left unemployed. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think that there's sometimes a gap in understanding the role and function of museums, even just within our community and on a national level. It did not compute to me that we had so many museum educators who literally part of their job is to align state and educational standards with curriculum. Why would you not have this conversation, this whatever, with museum educators, and you have this national need to have curriculum?
Yep, you're spot on. That's being, responsive, right? This is
Yes.
happening in the world beyond our doors. How can we pivot? That's been the word of our organization for the year. How can we pivot? What do we have? What resources do we have built that we can then take out to teachers, to families, to students and say, what do you need? And how can we marry the two? In what ways can we be helpful in this moment? Like, we know everybody's uncomfortable right now. Everything's on its head, but you're absolutely right. Like, it's like this perfect marriage that could be happening. And despite all that, you still see these trends of sweeping cuts that are happening across the country, and so many museum professionals that are unemployed. But I would say to those museum professionals, like, we are all very creative, turn an idea on its head kind of thinkers. And like, I do think that there are ways that we still can build things that would be useful for teachers. But as an organization, it is a little disheartening that like those resources are not being seen in that light.
Because I don't think that we think about museums as an extension of the classroom, or an extension, like it's a kind of, I don't know. I just think the whole notion of the business model, as opposed to like an educational system or like whatever it is. And I'm still trying to flesh that out, but
also just
yeah.
thinking about some organizations may not have been positioned in a way that they were built for a quick pivot to digital.
Right.
Which
I totally understand. But what I'm saying is the framework that, and I am speaking sort of generally, but the framework of museums is that, for example, how many museum directors come to museum work or come to the field having come from Fortune 500 companies, or coming with the mentality of we're running a bit like, so again, I'm not saying that museums are not businesses, but what I'm saying is like, I don't think that we frame museums, or we don't center the educational component. So for me, it's not even just about the pivot. It's about, yes, again, as someone in higher ed, education is a type of business, but then what's that framework for marrying the two that museums can be informed by, so that you then can pivot because you already understand.
You're already there. Yeah.
Educational component.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nina. What are you thinking?
To me, this brings it back to community, in terms of what I'm hearing is, when the rubber met the road of the pandemic, who is the community who we are actually, or a museum is well set up to serve. And I think that some museums did make a decision. I saw some museums that really said, we exist to serve our public, and we are turning our garden into a victory garden and partnering with our food bank. Or we exist to serve artists. I think about YBCA doing a lot of work around artist relief and creative, and focusing specifically on BIPOC artists in the San Francisco area. And they're now doing this whole thing around commissioning artists around response to like wearing masks in pandemic. And I hope and imagine there's some museum, my guess is it would be a science center or children's museum, that said, we exist, for that educational, for families. But I think that most museums and most boards and directors said, oh, at the end of the day, we exist for the people who've been our longest patrons. We exist to support and service, and ensure the stability of ourselves and our building. And I think that in a lot of ways, some of the rhetoric of being education oriented or being public serving was laid bare when organizations chose not to do that. I mean, I see it also, in the theater world. There were some theaters during protests this summer that said, we exist for our public, so we're turning our lobby into, a safe space for recharging water and things like that for protesters, or there's a whole debate in the library world, which has a very different business model, about, are they essential, or like, how do you respond to pandemic? If you've been making an argument for quite a long time, as we do in museums, that we are essential and not nice to have, well, what does that mean about not just what we expect in terms of support, but what are our responsibilities in a time of pandemic to step up? And I think that there's an interesting, I think there's, a lot of people are saying this about the pandemic, that it's not, that it's uncovering things, right? And so I think that maybe some of the hypocrisy of some of the rhetoric about who we serve has been uncovered by some of these decisions that, as you're talking about, Portia, seem pretty misaligned with an organization that might fundamentally be an educational institution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And just like asking our and having that moment of self-reflection as part of an organization as to why we matter. Like why, like in the end, why are why are we doing this work? And ultimately it's to serve, right? And to serve, you need to know what the needs are. And now a lot is coming to light. And so it might be a matter of after all of this, like in a post-pandemic world, shifting focus. Do you guys have any crystal ball inklings of what a post-pandemic museum world might look like?
A post-pandemic museum world. I don't have a cup. I don't have a mug like Nina.
All right, I'll pick up. Well, first, I would just want to put out there that from my perspective, the pandemic is one of two major, shifts that is being revealed in this year. And the other is about the just like deep, pervasive violence of white supremacy in museums. And I think that is not a new thing. It didn't come onto the scene because of a pangolin or because of, bacteria or something. I know nothing about epidemiology. Don't ask me about that. But I do know that, the sickness and the true epidemic of white supremacy in museums has been there really since most of their founding. And so, but I think there's a increased attention. So when I think about the after, I'm not just thinking about the after of, COVID, but I'm thinking about if there has been a greater awakening, if there's been a greater sense of accountability and need for committed action on racial equity and inclusion and justice, then what does that look like? And I think that my personal crystal ball feels like this is a year that has taken us from a spectrum of ways of engaging with these issues to some polarized approaches. And I think there is a group of organizations that have made the determination that we have the support, we have the legacy, we have the resources. We are going to put our heads down, ride this out, and come back pretty much as we were before and not really want to talk about it. And then I think there's quite a lot of organizations that either because of urgency from the outside or urgency from within have said, we must change. And we actually have an opportunity this year, because we are not open in the way we've been open, to reserve space to do some work on healing this other epidemic that has been plaguing us for a long time. And certainly the organizations, that we're working with are all organizations who said, we have to up our commitment, or we have to go from talk to action when it comes to racial equity, or we are not going to. It's not just about business model and survive, but about being able to legitimately stand by our mission and our promise about public service. And so I think that division is rooted in the kind of cataclysmic nature of these things. And I don't have a sense of like one of these is going to win out. But I think that it is becoming more acute. And I hope that it does mean on the other side that there's going to be more of kind of a brand promise in terms of the dollars you can attract, the board members you can attract, the partners you can work with, that is going to be rooted in, hey, which of these paths is your organization taking? Where have you made investments about where you're going next?
Absolutely. And a lot of museums right now are exactly what you're saying, or cultural institutions in general, taking this time to do that very important diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work. But it's making sure that you do that in a way that is not just in this moment, that it is part of the larger strategic plan for your organization. And, if you, I guess a follow-up question to that, it would be, if you guys were to give some advice to organizations that are starting to go down this path, what should you be thinking about? That it's, for me, like something in my mind is that it's not just right now. Like what you were just saying, like this has been going on for a long time, often since the founding of many institutions, but it's very raw right now and it feels very real. But like, how do you not lose sight of that so that it doesn't scab over? right? Like how do you keep it in the forefront of your institutional mission and planning, and where you need the institution to ultimately get to?
So
Portia.
I will respond to that. I also want to respond a little bit to Nina's comment. So if you don't know who Gloria Ladson Billings is, everyone should know who she is. She's one of our most important critical race theorists who is in the world of education. And she said at some point, I'm trying to think what month this came out, but at some point during the beginning of the pandemic, she talked about the fact that exactly what Nina was saying, that there are in fact 4 simultaneous pandemics happening, and that this is in fact a collective trauma event that we're all navigating, right? So the 4 pandemics are, coronavirus, so health pandemic, a racial pandemic, a climate and economic pandemic, a climate pandemic, and then an economic pandemic. So there are 4 simultaneous pandemics occurring. What I also want to say, I'm trying to think of that other question that you asked, but what I would also like for people to understand or know is like people like Nina, so of By for All, but there are so many folks in our field who are leaders, who are activists, who are doing this work. So we talked earlier about mass action. So when I think about people like Elizabeth Caljean, when I think about, Elizabeth and Anissa at Minneapolis Institute of Art are phenomenal. When I think about people like Paula Ramos, Alyssa Greenberg, Janine Bryant, I mean, there's so many people. So organizations like Mass Action, Museums and Race, Nikhil and I have a project called the Visitors of Color Project. When I think about individuals like Kate Livingston, who is a consultant, but who always is donating and uplifting and highlighting things, I guess what I want to say is, I would argue that in this moment, institutions that really believe in DEIA should look for people who are already and who have historically been leading these movements for change, pushing things along. The other thing I would say is, how can you, so I'm really big on this notion of like authenticity. How can you do this work if you have not made the financial investment to understand racial literacy?
Yep.
How can you say that you want to have diversity and you understand access and inclusion if the money has, you can't make assumptions about people's lived experiences, what they know, what they don't know. Money should be invested in organizations, including board members, including staff, including docents, in organizations like the People's Institute on racial equity, or just all of these different ways that you can actually literally put your money where your mouth is and really begin to understand racial literacy. So it's I don't understand how, I guess that would be my first piece of advice. Invest in some real training that is going to allow you to have not only language shifts, but mental and psychological shifts. Because these things are not ideas, they are associated with values, which are associated again with behavior changes. So you can't talk about, oh, well, we're going to diversify and we're going to do this and do that, if the person that's sitting next to you in the staff meeting, did they just attend a Trump rally and they're cool with that, but then they show up to work and they're like, yes, I believe in inclusion. You know what I mean? It really is. I guess what I'm trying to say is, this work is personal and political. So how are you showing up to your jobs? How are you showing up to do this work if you haven't internally done your own work? And everyone will, it's not a race. You will hopefully get there, but it just seems increasingly, it seems disingenuous to talk about DEIA if on the personal level you have not really gone on your own journey. I'm trying to think about, there's a video that I love. It went viral maybe like 3 years ago. Her name's Jocelyn. She's an Indigenous woman who lives in Canada. and she like was at a press conference or something, and she blasted this journalist because the journalist was being quite sort of rude. It was something about in response to I can't even remember what it was, but her admonition was, how are you going to talk about the fact that you believe in DIA when you haven't even gone on your own healing journey? And that's what she kept repeating, like, you're going to ask me this question and you're going to not understand why I am pushing back and asking about this DIA work that you're claiming that you're committed to when you haven't even gone on your healing journey. And I know that because of the question that you just asked me. So anyway, that's a long kind of response, but you can't do this DIA work if you haven't made the investment on the personal level and just on an institutional level. Like I mean, you kind of can, but you can't really. Not in terms of having like longevity and sustainability and having it kind of like baked into the process of what you're doing. What I have seen is people co-opting language. Anybody can co-opt the lexicon, anybody can co-opt language, but again, all of this is then related to little posture, how your behavior changes, how your thinking is changed, even how, again, your language shifts signal to the public that a change is occurring.
Right. Well, and it's also breaking down your own prism, your own worldview, and recognizing that there are perspectives that are beyond your own. Like everybody, like we're subjective. Like there's no way that we can be objective in whatever we're thinking about or talking about. You need to be able to let those other filters in, and giving people that cultural competency that there's perspectives beyond their own, not just like lip service, like getting the language right, but like being able to see that people have like different, exactly what you're saying, lived experiences, different perspectives, and like opening up your mind. And like that work is also very important to bring to the table when you're thinking about making major changes. And I love that you said the word authenticity. That is another one of our core values, and the importance of multiple perspectives and not sugarcoating to only having a singular, one-sided perspective. So like you're spot on. I totally agree with that.
Can I follow up as well? So that there are two thoughts I want to follow up on. One is, Portia, I absolutely agree with you. And I think one trap that some, particularly white people, can get into is like, let me just get all the training and all the learning, and then I'll just hold on to that. And now I've got it, And I think that one thing that when we really look at the ecosystem of what's happening with DEIA, one of the reasons of By For All has grown up the way it has been around, okay, for those who are ready to take action and to make some of those behavior changes, how do you make sure you can hold yourself accountable to actually acting on what you've learned? And I think that that component of not learning forever without using it to change your posture, to change your behavior, and then to learn from those changes and the mistakes and harms you make along the way, I think is really critical. And I think you're right that there are a lot of organizations and individuals who are just starting to do that learning. And then there are some who can kind of get stuck in a learning rut. And yes. I think that there is an opportunity to then say, okay, now what are we ready to do with what we've learned? And then what are we ready to commit to and to commit resources to? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I want to pull in around the healing, which is something I've been learning a lot about from my colleagues and from members we work with is, you use this quite evocative phrase, Katie, about not letting it scab over. And I think that it only can, quote unquote, scab over if during this time you are not becoming aware of and present to the wound inside yourself and the wound inside somebody else. Because, it is not going to scab over for people for whom it is an ever-present and potentially even exacerbating wound. And it's not going to scab over if you're not real with yourself about the harm you're causing to yourself and to others. And so I think that like scabbing over is another way of saying, like, unless we're going to, be inauthentic to what has been revealed. And particularly what we see, you don't have to go out into your community. One of the things that many people have been bringing up is that, hey, this work starts internally as well. Like, you have colleagues who are being directly impacted. You have colleagues who are being hurt, who have been hurt for a very long time, who have come up with ideas in past situations and have been dismissed for it. My colleague Raquel Thompson has really written and spoken beautifully about this criticality of doing the internal work alongside the external, and that in fact, if you do external work, if you make public statements and things like that and don't couple it with the internal, then not only can that seem disingenuous, but that can be deeply harmful to people who are like, wait a second, you care for people who look like me on the outside, but you're not showing care to me. And that's something that Raquel has really been bringing a lot of education into with our members and with our own team over the last several months.
That's such a good point, because it's performative.
Yeah.
And then it like deepens your own wound, because if you're already navigating a space where you're underappreciated or dismissed or all these things that you say, Nina, then it's like, what do you mean? It's what we saw with some of the Black Lives Matter statements. I guess I don't want to I know we have other questions. I guess the other thing I will put out there is, in a lot of the work that I've been so honored and happy and privileged to do with other institutions and with other organizations, what I would like for people to understand is that that this is a growth process, and that in this process of transformation and change and learning, that there is just no room for defensiveness. Because what you will see sometimes is a question or an examination or just drilling down on something. People sometimes take it as a personal attack. It's not a personal attack. It's just part of the growth and learning process. And I mean, I think if anything that 2020 has revealed, like, we're all unlearning. Unlearning is totally fine. And in fact, let's unlearn to the point where we are willing to emerge into something new. I don't know. That's the place
I really like that idea of unlearning. I know, Nina, you use that a little bit with of, by, all. And you have like a 5-step plan for transformation. Can you guys maybe muse a little bit about like this idea of unlearning? It's kind of a backwards idea, but it's very important to be able to shake off, our ghosts. Like, how do you start again?
Well, I would just
how do you do that? You can't have all the baggage that you carry with you.
Well, and I would just invite that, first, that unlearning is not a new idea. It's something that people have been talking about, particularly, you think about James Baldwin wrote about it. I mean, it's been talked about for quite a long time. And yeah, our team in the fall, Raquel Thompson, Lauren Benatua, Matteo Masi, and I worked together on this framework for unlearning, for institutional unlearning. And I can quickly run through it, which is basically to say, first, you have to really identify what's the thing we want to unlearn. Do we want to unlearn the idea that, there's one authoritative story about everything, or that museums are neutral, or that, our business model is rooted in X, whatever it might be, if you can name that. And then the next step, which is quite important, and a lot of activists, myself included, might be driven to skip over it, is to acknowledge what that thing has done for you in the past. Because probably there are others who are quite invested in that thing. And if you're only able to see the frame of this is terrible and we got to get rid of it, then you're not going to be able to yourself really engage with what did it do for you, but also what is it doing for colleagues who might not be where you are yet. So, there's this first acknowledgement. What did it do in the past? Then some visioning. Where could we go if this barrier was removed? If this, Omar Eden Martinez talked about this idea of like removing the plank from your eye. If we no longer had this particular assumption or this practice, what could it make possible? And then the last couple of steps, you can get quite practical and can say, who are the people who can be partners in making this possible? Sometimes there's somebody who might have a lot of power, and it's about listening to the people on the front lines, or particularly as Moana is writing into the chat right now, for communities of color who unlearn every day, who there are a lot of people who've been raising their hands for a long time saying, hey, we got to unlearn this, and have been ignored or have told that what they're saying is inconvenient or is not helpful. So who do you need to listen to? Or conversely, if you're the person who's been raising your hand forever and not getting heard, who are your partners who could be allies with power to bring that forward? And then what is a concrete place you could start? And we've seen organizations say, okay, we're not going to unlearn our whole exhibition model, but we could make a concrete shift in unlearning the idea that there's only one voice, one curatorial voice in an exhibition. And a concrete thing we could do is in our next exhibition, we could commit to having a curatorial panel that includes 3 community members, and that we're going to do multivocal labels. And it's like, what can you start to do so that there's some behavior change as a way to practice the unlearning, so it's not just all happening in your head? And while Portia is sharing, I'm sure, her brilliant ideas about unlearning, I'll find and share into the chat this resource that we created around unlearning in case people are interested in trying out those steps for yourself.
Great. Portia, what are you thinking about?
So again, in terms of like authenticity, like this work I've been doing, it feels like a long time. I mean, I have been doing this work a long time, but I'm only have been able to do it because I've made it personal. And I recognize that I can't show up and do the work if I'm not living it out, right? And I guess the only thing I can say is, like, for me, the unlearning helps me to get at the marrow even of my own so what. So if I'm choosing this field, if I'm choosing museums, if I'm choosing cultural heritage, if I'm choosing museums and libraries and archives, why? Like, I find sometimes that, like, people, if you ask people outright, okay, why museums? Why cultural heritage? Why this institution? People don't always have a readily available answer. So I guess, I don't know, for me, the process of unlearning helps me to better connect with the why, the reason for doing this work. For me, I feel like I've shared this now many times. For me, the journey into this work began with my mother, who was a 4th grade teacher, who helped to organize school field trips, who also had a deep love for historic house museums. So we spent many weekends on the road going to different historic house museums because she really loved history and she loved learning about silver and people and furniture. So she kind of instilled that passion in me. So I guess the long range answer for me is, the more that I divorce myself from the master narrative, and then also the cultural and social and regional narratives that have been placed upon me, the more I am deeply connected to my ancestors and then committed to unraveling the story of my ancestors, which then informs who I am in this moment today. So I guess
a wonderful transition, Portia. My next question was going to be about personal discovery and transformative museum experiences, because I think a lot of people, that key into the room is it's usually a personal journey, and especially for libraries or places that people can have that personal, like, aha moment, like where you can connect with perhaps your ancestors or information on your house or your neighborhood or something. You have a question that you're coming to the table with, and institutions that enable that, people be able to do history, to do research, to have that discovery moment. Those moments for them, they stick with them, like what you're saying, Portia, like going with your mom, and like it's part of who you are. And I think a lot of the people who work at institutions like cultural organizations, museums, libraries, it's because they've had that growing up. So how do we give people that experience? Like, how do we let people know that they can be a part of that, the discovery process, or that they can have have that sort of, aha moment, right? And so Portia, you shared with your mom. Nina, have you had any of those transformational experiences either as a child or in your many walks visiting all these wonderful cultural organizations across the world that changed you, that stick with you?
No, well, yeah, it's interesting because I often joke that I couldn't work in libraries because I love them too much. Like I have that deep story as a child with our branch library. You know, my sister and I would walk there after school, that kind of thing. And I actually was not, my family were not museum people. I was not into museums. And I actually got into museums more, I would say a little dispassionately, as like a design problem of like, oh, these places say that they are for, free choice learning and community gathering, but like, that doesn't seem like what's actually happening here. And I was intellectually stimulated by that disconnect. And also I was very excited by the promise and the premise. I'm reflecting on what Portia said earlier about the educational model. And one of the things I hear in my time spending with public librarians is public librarians will often these days say, if you came up with a public library as an idea today, it would be totally seen as a socialist in just like, no way, we cannot do this. What is going on? And I think that there is, for me, there's such promise. I'm so focused on public space and on this idea that like, hey, these spaces exist, they purport to be public, and they are often incomplete or insufficient in the extent to which they're, or inauthentic about how public they are. And so I guess my transformative experiences have been about, and I realize I recognize I'm saying this coming from a place of a lot of privilege, but experiencing a deep sense of othering when I walked into particularly art spaces and being like, man, and I gotta tell you also, for me, this discovery was when I was like in my late teens, early 20s, and I was leaving electrical engineering, which was like 1% women, I felt that there was othering all the time. And I was like, I'll go into museum, this seems like they say they're about free choice learning. And then I walk into those spaces, I'm like, how can I feel as lousy in this contemporary art space as I did in NASA? Like, what's going on here? And just because I think the rhetoric points to belonging, it points to community, and that isn't always lived up to. But I think the rhetoric is strong, and it's almost a reason why I think continuing to shift our language is important, but living up to the language we've had for 50 or 100 years is important too. And so that's why I get so focused on like, what are the changes? What are the behaviors that would be demonstrated if we were really living up to all the beautiful things in our mission statements and our value statements? And I think that, and I guess maybe for me, when I think about transformative experiences in public space, they are in spaces that are so authentic to their core about what belonging, how they live their values around belonging, and that there is just an embrace of very different kinds of people, not an outreached hand, not just an invitation, not just a door, but a real kind of celebration and embrace of what it means to be together. And so I think that is when I have those moments, and I have had those at several museums, that for me is when I know, wow, I'm in a place that's of deep authenticity to the core, and there's something good going on here.
That's awesome. All right, so Portia, did you have anything you wanted to say to that?
I just wanted to say, I kind of took this question a little, I really want to call, I feel like, I've been to a lot of different museums and it's hard to kind of narrow it down. And I so agree with Nina in terms of like, I am someone who, I am a cross-pollinator. So I have like a librarianship, information science mindset, and I focus on museums. I have to just in this space name and call out the Richland County Public Library System in Columbia, South Carolina. It's the most magical, amazing space ever. Everything that they do, every employee, every community offering is just so brilliant, and it's just my favorite place on the planet. The other thing is I want to call out one of my other favorite museums is the Museum of the African Diaspora, or MOAD, in San Francisco. And I remember, so in terms of like transformative experience, I don't recall the name of the exhibition. I just remember the experience. It's never left me. So I think when they first opened, I went, and there was just a little room. It was completely dark, and they were looping audio excerpts from narratives of the enslaved, formerly enslaved. And so there were like, it was like a whole like soundscape. There was like light, and I don't know how to explain it. It was just a fully sensorial experience. Have never forgotten it. I love everything that the Museum of the African Diaspora does. The other one is the Levine Museum of the New South. They have all this amazing programming, but they had this one exhibition called Nuevolution. And it was all about, in the last 30 years, how the impact, the changing of the region because of the increase of Latinx folks, and how they had built up all these communities. And it was one of the most participatory exhibits I've ever attended. And it was so dialogic and so fun and so compassionate. It was a very indelible experience. And I think another one would be the California Academy of Science. I attended, I forgot what it's called, but they have these like really amazing like after hours sort of like parties events. And it was just awesome. And it just made me, you could tell that there was so many people from different walks of life, so many, it was multi-generational. It was just so awesome. I think I've been a couple of times with one of my best friends who lives in San Francisco. And then I will also say, in full honesty, it's like a full circle moment for me to be in conversation today and to be in conversation with Nina, because I don't even know what year that was. Maybe 2015, I got a chance to attend museum camp. And even though this is not the question that you're asking, Nina and her staff showed all of us what it meant to think outside of the box of how you define a museum. So that experience of having the sleepover in the museum, having us go and talk about like all of the conversations that you all have been having about community and engagement and participation, it was so revelatory that it felt both like a museum experience and something that I still don't have a name for. And it was just so fantastic. I still have like lifelong friends from that singular event. Anyway, it just extended for me the notion of like what is a museum? What is a museum professional? How do you what's what I'm looking for? What is a visionary? And then from that, how do you create community? That's what Nina was able to do for not just myself, but for all of us. So I have to just say those are some of the transformative experiences that I've had. And I think about those experiences often.
Right. That's amazing.
Can I bring a museum example? Well, thank you, Portia. And you're making me think of, I just want to share two examples of museums that have really been special to me. One is the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle. And I think they do an incredible, one of the challenges I think that people often bring up is how do you have a culturally specific organization that really is in conversation with different communities? And this is a museum, Wing Luke, that is of the Asian experience in Seattle, but is celebrating so many different lenses and layers of the intersections of what it means to be an Asian American, what it means to be in Seattle, and also how to involve others. And it's just incredibly beautiful. And then the other museum I'd bring up that I got to visit a couple years ago was a tiny children's museum in Seoul in South Korea called Hello Museum. And the woman who runs it's kind of like the Pittsburgh Children's Museum, which I also love, where they work with artists, with neighbors and communities to create things that are really quite intelligent and interesting. But the thing I wanted to bring up is their name. And I said, why is this named Hello Museum? And she said, I've noticed as our city has gotten bigger that people don't, we have a culture that's very much about like connecting across generations and honoring elders. And it used to be really important how you said hello to others and elders on the street. And she said, I've noticed that as the city's gotten bigger, we won't say hello. She said, I want this to be a museum where people say hello to each other. And you could feel that inside. Even, they had this little rooftop garden. And when you were on the way up, they had a place where they had like some sun hats, and you could, if you needed a sun hat, and just this, kind of to going back to what Portia was talking about with Adrienne Marie Brown and the checklist, or this, authenticity and posture. It's like, it doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need a very long document. Like I saw how at that little museum, they were living this just core thing about people relating to each other in so many different choices they'd made throughout the building that really made me, particularly as a stranger in that community, feel not necessarily like I knew everything that was going on, because I certainly didn't, but that I was welcome, and that they were saying hello to me and inviting and expecting me to say hello to others as well. And I think sometimes we complicate ourselves too much with all of the documentation. And it's like, what could a core basic thing be that we could then just live in repetition as much as possible through how our institution works? I think that can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, creating that internal mantra that different departments can back, but it may manifest in different ways. Like that's, if we could all boil it down to a central concept like that, it would make our jobs a little bit easier. And also empower other staff, right? A lot of like what we've been talking about happens at a leadership level or at the board level, or, so one of the questions I think we'll transfer over to the Q&A from the audience is, how can we empower lower level or non-leadership members of staff to make these sorts of changes in their institution? And do you have any advice or resources for emerging museum professionals in the field? Oftentimes I feel like these are the people that are in these conversations, but it doesn't always trickle up, right? So how do you affect a change if you're not necessarily in a leadership role?
I think the first thing is make sure that you are reading. So I don't know the exact website, but if you Google it, the Mass Action Toolkit, that's a free resource that's available to everyone. I know that institutions around the country usually read it in chunks, do like a brown bag kind of thing. They talk about it, they share. There are resources. And again, Of By For All, Mass Action, Museums and Race. There's so many, Museum Workers Speak, so many individuals, organizations who are doing this work, who can also provide guidance and assistance. And there are, again, resources that are available to help you understand how to navigate making these changes. The other thing that I would also say is find your accomplices and understand the difference between an ally and an accomplice. So an ally is someone who might say, this thing that happened, police violence, murder number, whatever, is so terrible. I'm going to share this article and I'll express my outrage on social media platforms. I might even show up at a rally or a march. Whereas an accomplice is someone who's like, on your behalf and behalf of all of us, I'm going to write this email. I'm going to create a petition. I'm going to call for a meeting. I'm going, it's very action oriented, and it is with the intent that they understand that in doing this action, that they're likely to have, it will have likely some negative impact on them, and they don't care because they're going to go ahead and join you, be a co-conspirator. The other thing I will say is, I'm saying all that to say, you will burn out and you can't do this work on your own at your institution. You will burn out, or you will be othered, or you'll be isolated, or whatever. The other thing is, the more folks that you can find who can join your team on your behalf, on the collective behalf of everyone, the more that those voices and concerns are amplified. So it's not just you calling out something on your own, it's you in conjunction with all of these different people. So come up with a strategy and a plan. If there are changes that you want to make, it is often more challenging for a person in leadership to ignore an entire body of people or collective of people than it is to ignore a single person. So come up with a strategy and then share resources. And I'm saying all this, and I know for a fact that there's an institution where someone did this and they shared a link with the executive director, who then basically admonished and chastised that person. So I'm not saying that you can do all these things and everyone's going to be outright willing to listen to you, but come up with a strategy and identify your allies and your accomplices and your co-conspirators so that you are not taking on all of these things alone, but you have a group of people.
Yeah,
Talking
definitely.
about building power and building collective power, which is fun. I 100% agree. I would say that some people, sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about money. Sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about power. And you have to, get comfortable with the fact that, like, okay, hey, it can't just be the two of us bringing this forward. Who can we get involved in this circle as an accomplice, who has a different ear, who has a different opportunity? How do we build power? How do we put on some heat to this too? The other thing I'd offer is, particularly right now, directors are incredibly strapped. And whenever you can come, and this is probably true anytime, but especially now, if you can come to your director and not be saying, hey, we need to do X, Y, Z, or you need to do X, Y, Z, but if you can say, hey, I've heard you talking about how we, should become this anti-racist organization, and here are some ways I think we could advance that. If you can sound like you're solving their problem that they've expressed, as opposed to bringing them a new problem on a platter, you may get a different hearing. And I think what Portia just said is absolutely correct, though, too, that, look, sometimes you try to bring power and flex power and you get slapped down. And some people, particularly if you're, lower level, if you're a BIPOC person, have had that experience more than others. But there's also, that quote about, like, well, we can deny our own power. I'm not, anyway, I think that using the power that we have is important. And I guess I'd also just throw out, I just put in the chat, but we created this self-assessment just to get a sense of, like, what's your capacity to lead, revisioning, or change? Because I do think we have to be real about the fact that it's not just your desire or your perception of urgency that will drive change to happen. It's also, do you have some power in the space? And if you don't, how are you going to get some? How are you going to line up with others to do so? And how are you going to be really strategic about how you frame what you're trying to do so that there is a path for it to happen? And I think that it may feel it can feel kind of devious almost in terms of thinking about what's the right way to build power. But it's tactical work like any tactical work, and it's a good skill to have.
Absolutely. And kind of as a follow-up, thinking about staff at museums, a lot of organizations have been implementing these positions that are, social justice curators or community engagement type positions. I feel like that's a great step, but without the necessary resources to be able to do the work in a meaningful way, it might be a false start. So one of the questions is in the chat about this specifically, and do you the person's asking do you feel that more institutions should be going down this path and creating these sorts of positions? And is it actually like a viable path to create access and inclusivity in institutions? Portia, do you have any thoughts on that?
So there's the part of me that feels like we need, it's one of the many strategies for transformation of our entire field. So I guess, what am I also trying to say? If you ask people, what's a job title in the museum world, they will likely only be able to tell you curator.
Yep.
Maybe museum educator, maybe. So I guess part of it is we have a perception problem in that even just with the job titles and the public facing or lack thereof public facing positions, our public doesn't always even know or understand what it is that we do. So maybe there is some hope or opportunity in having more positions that clearly state and identify those changes in the forward facing notion of where museums or each individual institution wants to go. So the question was whether or not it was.
Is this a viable path, creating these positions? Like, I know a lot of places are doing it right now, but is it something that's sustainable? Is it something that will be successful, or is it just lip service?
I mean, it will be if the job description allows the job description and the work culture allows them to do that role in a healthy, meaningful way. But also, again, if that person is on their own individual healing journey, if they've done their work, and if the institution, again, has the resources that will allow them to do that. So I don't know. I mean, I've actually thought about this same question for a long time. I know that we have now, there's director of decolonization, and there's social justice. I mean, there's all, we've had, when I think about people like Cecile Shellman and Chris Taylor, had some of the first positions of director of inclusion. But again, they only work if the institution creates space for that type of growth. So I don't know. I just think that it has potential.
Yeah, I as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking about, if I could have a choice between all existing staff have now an accountability to, and are to some extent being measured on their ability to do work in a, in a justice frame or an anti-racist frame or wherever it might be, or we have one person who's really excellent who is in a silo doing that, I would always choose A. But to get to here, I think it often involves having some people in individual roles in the beginning, but having that that internal infiltration and instigation and spread be critical to it. And it almost brings me full circle back to what Portia was talking about with education, because if you think about it, the whole role of a museum educator is somewhat young. It's probably about 50 years young in the museum field. And there are some institutions where it has fundamentally transformed top to bottom what the expectations are of what that organization is. And there are others, as we talked about with the pandemic, where the pandemic kind of laid bare that, like, oh, this has become a really healthy silo. And so I think that there's an open question of, are we on a path to this becoming a marginalized silo, a healthy silo, or an infiltrated and full part of what an organization's accountable to. So I think that you need all these pieces, and I guess to me it's more about how are those pieces related to a goal, an end goal that is bigger than we have a really excellent person in one role.
Right. It's just one of the check boxes. They all need to be interconnected with resources to be able to get it done too. So I guess we'll wrap up the conversation with a little bit of a dreaming question. And so for both of you, what in your work, what kind of world are you trying to build, and how can we get there together? World can be your museum world, your personal world, the world out there, however you want to define your boundary.
I'm totally in a silly mood right now. I'm thinking about, I listen to NPR like all the time. What's that organization that's like, oh, we want to have a just, verdant, and whatever world? I love the word verdant, so I'm like, yes. Every time I hear them, I'm like, yes, just and verdant. And actually, that's what I want. I want a just, verdant world. Verdant both metaphorically, geographically. I want museum professionals to treat each other with loving kindness and care. We talked, in a lot of different ways about power. I want people to stop wielding their power in unhealthy, toxic ways in these environments so that real work can get done. I want, really and truly, again, going back to the Richland County Public Library, that institution has changed the entire arc of the library system in South Carolina, in the region. I want more of that. I want more of institutions that are doing such phenomenal work that it sets up the expectation for all of the other neighboring museums to have this type of change. Like I want, you're talking about new titles. Well, I want those titles to have a trickle down effect so that if there's a director of decolonization or social justice, whatever, in this institution, then there's an ask and a need for it to show up in these other institutions. So I don't know, I guess in terms of the world, I just want us to believe and know and understand that museums actually do have the power to change the world. And we can exist as a kind of tool. I want us to figure out the ways in which we can actually exist as a tool to empower and engage, and how can we help individuals and communities change their lives. So I don't know if that's a fully completed answer, but
That's great.
just and verdant and joyful.
Wonderful. Nina,
Um,
what do you see?
I want what Portia wants. I want more white women like myself to listen to what people like Portia and like many BIPOC leaders in our field and in our world are and have been visioning and dreaming for quite a long time. And I guess in my wildest, thinking about the verdant thing and thinking about, I live outdoors and one thing I think about a lot is like our resources on this world are finite, right? And so I want there to be many places where people can gather, can celebrate, can share stories, can make together. And I'm not necessarily exclusively invested in the institutions that currently exist, but they take up a lot of real estate. And so I want that real estate to be used to its fullest. And I heard Portia just talk about that trickle down effect and that spread effect of professionals attending to and feeling like, God, we gotta keep up. I want us to get to a point where community members are also that source of accountability, where they're walking into a museum and they're like, wait, I'm not seeing myself here, or my story's not here. That's messed up. And you should have a vehicle for us to change it. And I think that, I think that whole thing about the role that, often it gets framed in like consumer movements, but what does it mean when this stops being something we are only talking about within our professional space, but where there's the heat and the desire and the energy and the expectation from people, citizens, to hold us accountable to these aspirations and these great phrases and these things we're all excited to build. So I want us to build them, and I want it to not just be our choice or on our timeline, but based on what we are hearing and being accountable to in our communities, to serve their visions of what just and verdant and joyful resources look like.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much for this awesome conversation. This is really great.
Thank you.
I'm popping on to sadly say that our time together is up, and I just want to echo Katie. This has been really wonderful. I laughed. I felt like the beginning of a cry, and I think everyone in the audience will hopefully agree with me and really found that this was so useful, and hopefully we have some concrete takeaways to get to work within our own organizations and within ourselves. So I just want to thank Dr. Moore and Nina and Katie, thank you, and to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your presence. And so I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this program in the next week or so. I know there were a lot of wonderful resources that were also shared during the conversation, and we'll also be compiling those and putting them in that email so you can begin your continued education on these subject matters. I am quickly just going to say that support for these free virtual programs that we've been putting on are from our members and from our supporters, and we're so grateful for their generosity. And if anybody is interested, I encourage you to check out how you can become involved and how you can support us on our website, which is mdhistory.org. And although this is the final program of the year that we're offering, you can find recordings of all of our free virtual programs that have been held over the past 8 months on our website under the online resources tab. And we'll be publicizing our next group of spring programs in January, so keep an eye out for those. With that, thank you all so much. Happy holidays. Be safe. Hold your family close, and we'll see you guys soon.
All right.
Right.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
everyone.
all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.